Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the
Two Sisters on Adventures podcast.
Now, I know what you're probably thinking. They're only 3 weeks in, and they've already replaced one of the hosts. But it's still me. It's Carrie. I've just sort of lost my voice, so I may sound a little bit funny today. But that can't stop us in our recapping journey of our time on the John Muir Trail. So, where did we leave off last, Molly?
We were camping right below Donahue Pass at an elevation of about 10,000 or so feet. We had the longest day ever getting to the trailhead, and then we still had to walk about 12 and a half miles to get to our first campsite. So once again, there was some tossing and turning in the tent the first night. We didn't have quite the sleep we expected. And then probably, 2-3 hours into our sleepless night, there was this spotlight shining on us.
Yeah, and I think we thought, oh my goodness, who's outside our tent? They just showed up and we didn't even hear them coming. And all of a sudden we realized it was a full moon, and that full moon honestly would come to haunt us through about the first half of our trip because it was so bright in our tents every night. I feel like tents are typically made to kind of disperse light so that if you have, your headlamp hanging up there, you can read and all that kind of stuff. And it just, it was quite the spotlight. So in the morning after we were done getting spotlighted all nicely, I looked at my journal today, and Molly and I are chronically late camp leavers, I would say. And honestly, it's never been a problem for us, even on backpacking trips where we, would spend 12 hours hiking. We still get into our tents at a reasonable enough time for us. But some people may be shocked when they hear we left our campsite at 8:30 a.m. that day, and we started our journey up to go over our first big pass of the entire John Muir Trail and our first time over 11,000 feet, Donahue Pass. And so we just kind of started right up there, and we were taking it a little bit slow, taking it pretty easy because Molly had felt kind of unwell from the altitude the day before. And I think that both of us were kind of what's it going to be like for us just going for days and days at altitude? But we were talking about it the other day, and we've had some questions about how did we train beforehand? And
essentially we believe that, you have to have a good level of conditioning to start out with before a hike like this. But the best way you're going to get good at hiking and backpacking is by hiking and backpacking. So Carrie and I, while we lived in Oregon, we kind of had this rhythm of life where the winter was almost kind of our off season for hiking. And then when I feel like
we still would hike, but it was the miserable hiking in Oregon, It's raining buckets. You're soaked through all of your layers. But you've still gone 8 miles, and that was kind of your 8 miles for the week. Though.
But once we got into, when it would be kind of April and May, we'd start to kind of ramp up our distances. Mm-hmm. So the months before we started our hike, which was in September, we averaged generally in the neighborhood of 100 to 120 miles of hiking with about 14,000 to 23,000 feet of elevation. So we kind of do this thing where we start out right with lots of day hikes, then we increase our distances as it gets closer to spring and early summer, and then we start to plan in some backpacking trips where usually we'll do we have to break in ourselves for backpacking every year. So we usually like to start out with just a 2-day trip
to find out what we've left behind.
And this was the challenge of Oregon in 2022, and it's a similar year it seems this year where the snowpack was fairly high, but it wasn't that much more than normal. However, spring was late because we kept getting a lot of precipitation in the lower elevations and snow higher elevations well into really April and May. Yeah. So then,
and it was still it was a very rainy June and early July. Yes. It was still just rain.
So we planned to do our first backpacking trip of the year in Oregon over July 4th weekend, and we had a couple different plans. We'd been successful in the past doing a backpacking trip that same time frame in the Mount Jefferson Wilderness, and it was so much fun. But then in 2022, there was still feet of snow on the Pacific Crest Trail going through the Mount Jefferson Wilderness. So we did not want to just post hole through snow the entire trip. So we were looking. This
was supposed to be our fun and easy breaking it in backpacking.
Exactly. Trip. Oh man, I spent just hours looking all over the state. We thought about going all the way down to California to, where is that?
Castle Crags.
Yeah, we thought about going all the way to Castle Crags just because it had a better weather forecast. So we had finally settled on hiking near near Mount McLaughlin in Southern Oregon on the PCT because we could drop 2 cars and hike with one of our friends and do like 2 15-mile days just to get ourselves in the rhythm. And it still ended up raining on us the entire second day. And we didn't have to hike in snow, but we had like so many mosquitoes.
Yeah, so it was pretty much one of those type 2 fun misery hikes where in the end you're glad you did it, but at the time you're kind of like, this is my 4th of July weekend.
Yeah,
and I'm just out here totally soaked, covered in mosquitoes, and the rain just like would get worse and worse, and then there'd just be like rain in our head nets for the bugs, and then but you still had to wear them because you didn't want the bugs to get all up on you.
We were really fortunate last year then to get a Copper Ridge Loop permit for the North Cascades National Park, and it was an absolutely wonderful itinerary, so gorgeous with like so many stories. And
hopefully we'll be able to tell you them someday.
Honestly. So we did that trip, and it was like really harsh terrain, really hot. I think it was like a 60-mile trip that we did in 5 days, and it was hard based on just the terrain that we had. So
but
we kind of started we did like, I think the 5-day backpacking trip at the end of July. And then in August, we had about 100 miles, and it was a mixture of like a couple very long day hikes. Like we did one of the hikes in the Olympic National Park, like a 23-mile day hike, and then a couple like quick Alpine Lakes Wilderness one-night backpacking trips, etc.
And Mount Jefferson had just reopened. It had been burned in 2020 fires, and we went there for a 40-mile backpacking trip because that was the only permit we could get. So we had a significant number of miles, but I think that the thing that Molly and I would both say is most important for preparing for a long backpacking trip like this is just getting those hours under your belt, because I've seen so many things posted for like, here's your gym routine for if you're planning the John Muir Trail. And of course it's different for everyone. You know, there's nothing wrong with going to the gym, but I think ultimately if you can have some days where you're out just walking, and if you're walking weighted down with the weight of your pack, even better. But just walking for like 6 or 7 hours, because that gives you something more realistic, right? You go to the gym and you go really hard for 1 hour, and that does not give you the same, like it gives you a different sort of stamina than walking for like 7 or 8 or even 12 hours.
And I saw they had done this study a while, just actually fairly recently, that talked about how if like you don't have, you know, elevation or altitude to gain, right, incline, doing something like running raises your heart rate so it can condition you in a similar way as walking uphill if you don't have access to that. However, just like Carrie said, we've, you know, met people over the years where they have pretty good level of fitness, like they either running or like before something they were maybe doing a lot of stair training at the gym, and so they're really good at that for like a 30-minute bout or, you know, an hour and a half, 2 hours. But when it comes to backpacking, that is like a long endurance type of sport where you have to be able to sustain over the time frame. So honestly, a variety of training modes is good, but just being able to go for multiple hours, and then like ideally you could do a shorter backpacking trip before the JMT so that your body has the chance to do that. I've gone for, you know, 10 hours today, and then I have to do that tomorrow, and you can figure out your pace and kind of get some really realistic expectations.
So I think we're pretty much Molly and I on a very similar page, which is definitely, you know, work out however you normally would, what's normal for you, but just getting those hours out in the wilderness, getting that time with your pack on, so that you're not shocked when you're at a high altitude and you have your pack on. Because ultimately, we didn't feel very affected by the altitude in the end. And I think a lot of it was, yes, of course, we got tired after a certain point. But it was like our body, we had already asked our body to walk all day before. And our body just kind of was like, oh, okay, we're going to do this again.
And it was pretty fun because we moved from Oregon back to North Dakota a week and a half before our JMT start date. And so we hadn't done really any, you know, big hiking. It'd been like a week and a half. So we decided, let's do one more big day. So we just threw on our packs, and we probably had like 20 pounds in each of them. And we did a 12-mile, like, air quotes, hike around our family farm. And it was actually so much fun. We walked on a lot of gravel. We had a little blacktop. We walked past like a neighbor mowing her lawn, and she was like, come inside and have lemonade. And so we just got 12 miles.
An hour.
Exactly.
It took us a couple. I mean, it didn't
like
take us that long.
It took us like 3.5 hours.
It was just moving your body for a sustained period of time.
Yeah. And it worked out. It worked out well.
Yeah.
So thinking about our second day on the trail then, we've already gotten our real, just the hurdle of getting there. We've gotten on trail. So there's like kind of a comfort in like knowing like, okay, I've done this before. I can do it again. But we were both curious what it would be like to go over Donahue Pass, because really the highest point we'd both been on before that was the South Sister in Oregon, which is like 10,300. So.
And there's another like piece to when you're finally on the John Muir Trail too, of where you've read about all these places, or for me, I'd like studied the map and thought about them, and so you kind of have them in your imagination, but you have no idea what it's actually going to look like.
Yeah.
And so it was exciting as we got a little bit closer, because I kind of started to see kind of more of that classic Sierra look, right? Where there's some granite, and there's that, like, I have a shot of just this beautiful clear lake where it was so deep, but it looks like you could touch the bottom because it's so clear. And so we kind of started heading up that pass, and as we got to the top, we actually saw a ranger up there, and she checked our permit. So if you're thinking about, do rangers actually check permits out there? They do. And she was really lovely, and we visited with her for a couple minutes, and then we just kind of really took it in, I feel like.
Yeah, and Carrie and I, from all of our hiking in Washington, we just like love the power of a glacier and seeing terrain that has been transformed over time by the work of glaciers. So I remember we talked with the ranger just a little bit about some of the shrinking glaciers and just like the terrain that had been caused by glaciers long ago. And then we also talked about how it was so smoky down in the valley.
Yeah, but it was so clear up at Donahue.
Yeah, she'd been up there for, I think, a couple days, so she didn't even know about that situation. But it was fun to visit with her, and then really just enjoy the scenery.
And so after we got up to Donahue Pass, do you remember how long it took us to get up there? We just kind of popped off our packs.
It was like an hour and a half from our campsite. Yeah,
we popped off our packs and kind of enjoyed the view, and it was really funny because I actually had cell service up there, and I feel like that was like, it was so weird. The first few days we kept having cell service, and I typically don't even look for cell service, but I would like turn off my airplane mode just to see something, and then I get all these texts, and so we took a couple pictures together and enjoyed having our packs off, which I'm just going to put a pin in this for 1 second and go back to our earlier conversation, because the thing I wanted to say was, when we would do our one-night backpacking trips, we were still backpacking with packs that were filled like we were going to be out for a week.
That's true.
So it wasn't like we added a ton of weight for the John Muir Trail, because we would even bring like the food we needed for a week. And so I think people probably thought we were like crazy. They'd be like, how many nights are you going to be out here? And we'd be like, one night. And we had like giant packs filled with so much food. So I just wanted to insert that so people didn't think like, oh, I'll just go backpacking with like my one night backpacking gear and be ready. Okay, now moving back into what we were just talking about. So we were kind of just sitting at the top of the pass, enjoying ourselves, enjoying the fact that we'd finally, made it to 11,000 feet for the first time in our lives. Other than the airport at Denver. Yeah. And we had this guy who came by, and he kind of just dropped his pack, and he wanted to start talking to us, and he was a really neat dude. He was from
French Canadian.
Yeah, he was French Canadian. And I was talking to him kind of about, man, isn't it so hard to get out on this trail? Because for me, my experience was like planning, preparing, not having our bus tickets work. Everything's kind of stressful and difficult to make work. But he was so funny. He just cracked us up. He was like, well, it's actually very easy to plan for the trail. Like, I just flew to America, and I hiked like 300 miles of the PCT in Washington, and I didn't know exactly where I was going to go. I just would hitchhike with whoever would let me, and I bought food at gas stations, and he resupplied from the hiker boxes that he would find along the way, and he was just very go with the flow. So it's kind of fun because on the trail you meet all these different people that Molly and I like to call trail characters, where other people on the trail that you talk to, they make such an impression that they'll remember them too, and they'll have their own stories about interacting with them. And so he was kind of our very first trail character that we met. He had kind of a more distinctive little outfit on, like, I don't know, just
like a big broad-brimmed sun hat.
Yeah, his broad-brimmed sun hat. Everybody just knew who he was. And so it's kind of fun having that experience of someone who just had such a great personality and was fun to visit with. And down the line, you could bring him up, and other people would say, oh yeah, I saw him too at this other place, and we had this conversation.
Yeah, I would say there were like probably 10 to 15 people who we talked to subsequently who had visited with him as well. Yeah. And he just really embodied like how
hike your own hike, right?
Exactly, yeah. It could be like a very just like free-flowing, very hiking your own hike kind of experience on the trail, and in a way it's kind of inspiring. Like, he didn't stress over it. He just walked and he was fine.
Yeah, and he was fine. And so I just thought that was really fun. And then as we kind of headed down Donahue Pass, of course, it's really exciting because you're like, well, I've gone uphill this whole time and now I'm going downhill.
And I will say that like 99.9% of the time, I prefer going downhill than uphill. I just love to like the flow of going downhill, and it's so much less taxing. Going down Donahue, though, you did have to kind of find good footing because it's pretty rocky. But once again, it's not as challenging on the rest of the body to go downhill than up. And
it was fun too to look at the scenery.
Oh my
it was
gosh,
kind of the first entry into the stunning scenery of the Sierras, right? We
gorgeous.
left behind Lyle Canyon, which was pretty in its own way, but we were coming into the Sierras.
Yeah.
And so that first day, it was kind of funny because you go up and then you think like, time to just go down till I get to my campsite.
Yeah, nope.
But that first day we went over Donahue Pass, but we also went over Thousand Island Pass, which is kind of a more minor pass. It's not very high. But it was really beautiful. At the top of the pass, it was kind of a grassy area with all these depressions where there was water, and it was very reflective of like the rocks around it. So of course there was just a lot of up and down that day. We went to Island Pass, and we also got to go past several different lakes, Garnet Lake, Emerald Lake, and Ruby Lake, which were just so beautiful. And of course Thousand Island Lake, which is one of those really iconic lakes that probably if you've ever seen like a calendar photo of the John Muir Trail, or even I think of, sometimes I feel like people include it in pictures from Yosemite, even though it's technically not within the park.
Yeah.
It's just one of those really iconic places on trail. And it was so cool to actually get to be there and stand there and view it.
And so before we even got to Island Pass, we were still just descending Donahue. And once again, we hadn't seen all that many people, right? Like we'd seen the
ranger,
the French Canadian, and then we didn't see anyone for a while. I think we saw another couple of people, and then all of a sudden we encountered this like large group of people hiking. Like it was probably 12 people, and they were all outfitted with like the same like packs, and so you could tell that it was probably a group of people internationally traveling the Sierras. And so we stepped aside, and they walked by, and then about
probably 20 minutes later, we saw these two other ladies, and they were clearly from the same group because they were outfitted in the exact same outfits and packs. And as we kind of rounded the bend, they were so excited to see us, and they kept saying, picture, take a picture. And I was like, absolutely, I'll take a picture of you guys. Like, it's beautiful, it's a good day, it's sunny. And they were like, no, we want a picture with you. And so it was kind of funny. We had this little like photo shoot with them where like one of them would stand in the middle and they'd take a picture, and then the other one would stand in the middle and they'd take a picture. And they were just these really nice ladies. And it just cracked us up so much, though, because it was kind of another trail character moment where later on we met people and we'd say, did you meet this group of people? And they'd say, well, yeah, like they gave me candy. And then someone else was like, yeah, they camped right next to me. And I was kind of like, why wasn't I the one who was given candy? Why was I just the picture one?
I wanted candy.
We definitely kind of thought that was one of those fun and unique moments.
I describe myself as being like very much a glasses half full type of person in the backcountry. And so we finally descended Donahue Pass, and then I think the trail was level just like a tiny, tiny bit. There was a river, so we decided to stop and have our lunch there because we were about halfway through with our planned itinerary for the day. And I just like was so used to, once again, I've been on many backpacking trips where you'll hit elevation like, 2 times in the course of a day. But so much of hiking also is like you go up, you meet your objective, you go down, and you're done. And so here I was thinking like, we hit Donahue. That was the tallest pass that we're going to hit for like several days. Yeah. And now it's like all downhill from there. But little did I know, Island Pass is not like the biggest or toughest pass in the Sierras, but we were still going to have to go up a hill another 1,000 feet or so. So we had our lunch, and it's pretty wild because Carrie and I, we both wear trail runners. And several years ago, I used to wear hiking boots. And I don't know if it's just like the speed at which we hike, but I would always get blisters on like my right heel. And so one summer I just decided to be like, you know what, I'm just gonna keep trying hiking boots until I find the one that works for me. And newsflash, I never did.
Yeah, there was a lot of hikes that we'd go on where she'd be carrying like a second pair of shoes off of her day pack.
Oh my gosh. And one time I was gonna bring a second pair of shoes to wear, and then I accidentally got Carrie shoes or something.
No, you didn't. I saw you bring 2 bags of shoes to the car.
Oh, gosh.
And I thought, how
shoot.
thoughtful. Molly already put my hiking boots in the car for me. And we show up at the trailhead a few hours from our house. And I was like, she gets her boots out, and I grab the other bag, and it's just 2 bags of Molly's boots. And so I actually just wore Birkenstocks on the trail that day.
And that was to Jeff Park.
Yeah.
And so we had, like, from Whitewater Trail. So
Yeah,
it was like
a 13-mile round trip.
Yeah, and Carrie did
hike.
it in Birkenstocks.
Yeah, yep. I was like, people are probably judging me, but what they don't know is that it's not my fault.
Exactly, it was my fault. Like many things, but
Yeah.
But anyways, so we wear trail runners, and like the ankle stability has been fine. Like the comfort level has been amazing, and then even just like wearing them sometimes for river or creek crossings, and then the fact that they can dry. So I like to wear ultras, and Carrie likes to wear Hokas, and
speed goats. And so I've worn speed goats pretty religiously for several years. And for all of our backpacking trips, I've always worn my speed goats. And I had a pair that I had kind of broken in. Typically, I wear my speed goats for work and for backpacking. So sometimes I'd be out there just like hosing off my shoes, and then I'd set them in the sun to dry and go to work. And so I feel like that really helps them get broken in a way where I don't get blisters, because I wear them for like walking really intensely under weighted packs, and then I wear them at work, which is a totally different experience for them. But I was getting blisters, and it was the weirdest thing, because I've actually never had blisters before from shoes. But fortunately, I had this thought, like one of those wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat moments of like, what if I get some blisters? And so I found this thing called Leukotape.
Yeah.
And I had read that it was awesome for blisters, because it's like once you put it on, if it gets wet, it still stays on, and it's not going to like rub off with sweat or your shoes. And so we bought some of that, and we bought some, what was the other thing, KT?
It was a pre-wrap.
It was a pre-wrap, that's what it is. We bought
so
some
that you don't have to
so that you don't
tape
have, put tape
skin.
directly on your blister. And so we kind of sat down at lunchtime, and I was like, I think that I'm going to need to put that on. And while we were putting it on, a group of people came by.
Yeah, and there were 4 of them, and like my initial impression, there was one guy, and he just like had this big smile on his face,
Yeah,
and he wanted to make sure that we were doing okay, which I thought was
nice.
Really nice. And so we said, yeah, we're just dealing with blisters, but we're okay. So they hiked on, and then it was like a little bit funny, because one of the guys in their group, he was carrying his beer canister. Yeah. And at the time we were like, that's interesting.
We're like, interesting. And it's one of those situations again where it's a group of people that you meet up with later down the road, because you're all hiking the same thing. And he later told us that he basically had to carry his bear can at first, because it was the John Muir Trail was actually their first backpacking trip.
Yeah.
They'd never backpacked
They were
before.
amazing. Their first
trip.
They
were awesome. I mean, I can't believe how well they did just fine. And it's one of those things where it's nice. I'm not necessarily advocating it being your first backpacking trip. I'll break in to say that they had a lot of experience doing other outdoor stuff first, and they were in really good shape. But it's one of those things where, I mean, they were getting their gear mistakes kind of out of the way on the trail.
Yeah.
And so the one unfortunate thing for him was it was like 85 degrees on the trail at the beginning. Gosh. And so when they got to Red's Meadow, he actually sent one of his jackets home so that he could make space to put his bear can in his backpack, which later on, I think he regretted a little bit, because it did get cold. Ultimately, everything was fine. And like we just said, like they were the nicest people, and totally amazing that they were able to make that their first backpacking trip. But it was kind of one of those funny things where you see someone and they come around to play a part in the story later.
Exactly, yeah. So that was the first time we met them, and once again, they were just like walking by like, hey, you guys good? And we're like, yep. And then fast forward, I think a couple more days down the road, we actually got to know them a lot better. Yeah. And there were 4 of them at the time, and then I think one of their friends decided to leave the trail at Red's Meadow, and so then our kind of like little name that we gave them afterwards was the 3 friends. We
always called them the 3 friends.
And we always loved leapfrogging them, and we have more stories we'll share about them kind of down the road. But like Carrie mentioned, it was so hot. The first couple days we hiked, once again, this is in September, and it was part of the heat wave. And so I think it was the first 3 or 4 days. It was kind of like the Sierra weather pattern that you'll get if you're hiking in the summer. And that is like you have this cloudless sky in the morning, and around noon, the clouds kind of start to roll in, and then the thunderstorms come after that. So that's where it is really important, if you're going over a pass, to make sure you're doing it in the morning so that you are not putting yourself in a situation where you're the tallest thing around if there's lightning. And there was another trail character that we met further down down the road, and he talked to us about how he was on
Forester Pass.
Forester
in a lightning
Pass,
storm.
yeah, and how he said,
He was like, if I'm gonna go, Lord, let me be struck by lightning and not from hypothermia, because my kids will think that's cool.
and I was like, why not just be like, let's not die
I
today?
was like, I'd be trying a different prayer, I think.
Exactly. So so it was hot, and so we ascended Island Pass in the heat, and then as we started to descend and we were really getting
Towards
close
Thousand
to
Island Lake.
Thousand Island Lake is when the clouds kind of started to roll in, and there was some thunder, and you could see areas where it was raining. It didn't rain on us. And then once again, being kind of the glass half full person, at that point I was like, okay, so we've gone over 2 passes, so now we're going to have all downhill to our campsite. But no, that was not the case. What I learned about that section of the Sierras is anytime you're going by a lake, you can pretty much expect to ascend from the lake and then descend to the next lake. And so Emerald Lake and Ruby Lake were really, really beautiful.
I honestly, if I could camp at a spot, I feel like I would camp at Ruby Lake if I had a chance.
Ruby Lake was gorgeous.
Because it was just so pretty and quiet.
And it was gorgeous, but it was like the second day on trail and a fairly long day for us.
Yeah.
And by the time I got to Ruby Lake and realized I had to go uphill again to get down to Garnet Lake, I was like, oh, man.
And then it's like, we're not camping at Garnet Lake, so I already know what's going to happen there.
Exactly. So, yeah, I remember the ascent from Garnet Lake. I was feeling pretty tired and kind of like almost ready to be done with that day.
Yeah.
And then it was like a long, dry descent. We planned to camp at Shadow Creek, which you do have to be pretty aware in that area because there is no camping within a certain distance of Shadow Creek and no camping at Shadow Lake.
Yep.
So we had a pretty long, dry descent after Garnet Lake.
Oh, yeah.
And at that point, the thunder started up again and it started raining on us.
Yeah.
And it was actually like those just like fat drops that like they land in the dust and they don't even make it wet.
Yeah.
And it was kind of actually like a fun
it was like
amount of
a
rain.
sunny rain, and it was kind of fun.
And it was kind of fun too, because on that descent is where we met our first mule train.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think there were 2 different guys on horses, and then they had mules, and it was
those dudes look real smug with their candy
I know.
as they sit there,
One
and
of the
you're
guys,
like sweating.
he was either eating like a Hershey's bar or like M&Ms, and they're just like riding uphill.
Yep.
And you think like, oh man, maybe the mule train was the way to go.
I'm like, I'm feeling pretty interested in owning a pack of mules.
Exactly. So it was the end of like a 16-mile day for us, and we were just coming into that Shadow Creek drainage area, and I think we had talked to the ranger at the top of Donahue that morning, and she had kind of detailed a little bit more about where we could camp versus like not obviously close to the creek. So she was the one that told us, right?
Yep.
Okay, so we kind of knew where to look for a little bit of like a footpath at a certain point where the Shadow Creek Trail intersects with the JMT. So then we headed uphill from there, and there were some pretty nice campsites. There were probably enough to pitch like 4 or 5 tents in that area.
Spot. That was
super flat. And so I found this spot, and I was like, Carrie, this is the spot. You had like a little bit of a view of Shadow Lake, and I was like, yes, let's pitch our tent here for our second night.
And I was kind of like, okay, well, like, let's also look at the surrounding areas, because when you pitch your tent, right, you want to pay attention. Is there a tree that's leaning completely over that looks like it may fall on me in the night or with any sort of wind, But in the Sierras, you have to be kind of thinking about rain. And it was funny because the spot where she was talking about camping was by this like angled granite wall. And I was like, I think that if we camp there tonight and it rains, we're going to be sleeping in a bathtub. So we found a different spot kind of in some trees instead.
Yeah.
And honestly, I loved that campsite.
Yeah.
It was nice. It was really quiet. When we went down to the Shadow Creek, it was like a beautiful creek, and there was a meadow, and there were some deer in there, which made us always glad for our water filter.
Amen to that.
I always say, like, when you look at the rivers in the Sierra, you're like, oh, I should just be able to drink right out of that. And then you look upstream and there's a deer, and you're like, I think I'll filter this water.
And honestly, we actually had some energy that night because that was like the only two nights we made ourselves dessert.
Yep.
We had our backpackers pantry creme brulee, which is so good.
Very good.
And it's kind of funny because we made Carrie made a lot of different desserts for our trip, but it turned out that I feel like we were just so exhausted.
Yeah.
We only had energy to make our meal.
Yep.
And then, we didn't even have the energy to, eat a dessert, but we still had enough energy to eat a dessert that night, and that was fun.
Yep, we definitely ended up with a nice little sunset that night and all that good kind of stuff, and that was kind of our second day on the trail.
So in my journal at the end of day 2, I had wrote that the most challenging part of the second day on the trail was just all the ups and downs. And honestly, we were so focused on Donahue being that 11,000 foot pass that we didn't even think about Island Pass. And it's not the tallest pass, but once again, it's just changing your gear from going downhill back to uphill. And then it was so gorgeous seeing Thousand Island Lake, but then once again, the 2 other episodes of downhill and uphill, it was tiring. Yeah. But I had wrote in my journal that the most had written.
I wasn't going to correct you the first time, but now you've done it twice.
And as I'm saying it, I'm trying to figure it out, so thank you. I had written in my
grammar
journal.
Girls.
Yeah, we are. I had written in my journal just that the most rewarding part was the 11,000 feet, hitting that mark and actually feeling okay. Because we were both nervous about how we do. And then reflecting on it now, I think the highlight for me was just that we had that first glimpse of what it's like to backpack in the Sierras where, we started and the scenery was a lot of the Donahue Pass and descending and seeing Donahue Peak and the Mammoth Mountain area in the distance. And then, as we descended Island Pass, it was Thousand Island Lake, dominating our visual field. And then by the time we made our camp, the mountain that's behind Thousand Island Lake, we couldn't even see it anymore. It was so far in the rearview mirror. And just the concept of being in the Sierras, such an expansive area that you can walk. And at the end of the day, you can't see anything that you started out seeing is just the most beautiful thing to me.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wanted to also let people know if you want to see any pictures or videos from what we're talking about, with each podcast, we post some of our favorite pictures and videos from that experience on our Instagram, which you can find. It's 2 Sisters on Adventures with the number 2, like how our podcast is. Or you can follow us on Facebook if you want to see any of those photos and videos, and if you want to keep up with any information about the podcast. Also, I've decided that we're going to start putting up a question box just so people can drop any questions as they have them. And if you happen to miss the question box, feel free to message us, because at a certain point, we would love to do a Q&A and just answer some questions that people have.
Yeah, and thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. And we love, once again, sharing this experience. It's really fun for us. So I hope you enjoyed. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the 2 Sisters on Adventures podcast.
Hopefully next week we'll have gotten back our original Carrie.
Okay, bye.
Bye.